I've interviewed hundreds of Christian leaders over the last 25 years, and I've asked them why they refuse to confront a culture, a society, and especially a government that has become increasingly more hostile to God and to the people of faith. And the most prevalent answer that I have heard coming out of the mouth of pastors is that Romans 13 teaches us that we have to submit to every law of human government. Now, this is the most important lesson of all the lessons, because what we're doing is essentially laying the foundation. We're laying the groundwork for everything else that we're going to build on from this point forward. If you get this wrong, you will get everything else wrong, because you're laying a faulty foundation for not only your spiritual life, but also your political ideology. So let's now confront lie number one, that we must submit to every law of human government. Recently, I was searching the internet and I found an article titled, "Homeland Security Enlists Clergy to Quell Public Unrest If Martial Law is Ever Declared." The article reads, "Such clergy response teams would walk a tightrope during martial law between the demands of the government on one side versus the wishes of the people on the other. For the clergy team, one of the biggest tools that they will have in helping calm down the public or to obey the law is the Bible itself, specifically Romans 13. When interviewed, one pastor stated, "Because the government's established by the Lord, you know, and that's what we believe in the Christian faith, that's what's stated in Scripture." The problem is the federal government has been removing Christ from virtually every aspect of American society since the 1960s. They've removed the Bible from our classrooms. They have replaced the story of creation with the story of evolution, which, by the way, categorically denies the existence of the Creator. But now they want to use the authority of the Bible and the commands of the Creator to tell us that we need to obey the government because God says so. Washington cannot have it both ways. They either need to recognize God as supreme, as our founding fathers did, or they need to reject Him completely. There is no middle ground. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a long, hard look at the true interpretation of Romans 13 and then see if we cannot justify this position with the rest of Scripture. Now, before I start, allow me to give you an illustration from my time in the United States military. When I entered the United States Air Force at the age of 18, I found myself at the bottom of a very large chain of command, starting with the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, and going down through generals and captains and various levels of sergeants. Now, there were times that I was giving a set of conflicting orders by two people above me in the chain of command. I would have the general give me an order to go do something, and I would go do it. And then the sergeant would come up and say, "Hey, I need you to stop and go do something else." What this would do was put me in a no-win situation, because I was essentially going to disobey one of the two sets of orders. I was going to disobey the general, or I was going to disobey the sergeant. Now, this situation is pretty easy to navigate, because I would simply ask myself who is the highest ranking in that chain of command, and then I would simply obey their orders. Now, there were times where I would have sergeants approach me and ask why I was not carrying out their orders. And I would tell them, "Well, the general told me to do this." And I had actually had one sergeant tell me, "I don't care what the general said, obey my orders or else." Now, in that situation, I would go to the general and explain that the sergeant was threatening with punishment for disobeying his orders. And the general would not understand. He would just say, "Why didn't you just tell him that I told you to do this?" And I would say I did, and he said he really didn't care what you thought. So the general would have him sent in, and when the sergeant left the office with about half his backside removed, the lower ranking official would concede and say, "You need to obey the highest person in that chain of command." Now, with this story as a backdrop, let me use this as a jumping off point and take a look at Romans 13 to find out what this scripture is really teaching. Romans 13, 1 and 2 says this: "Let every soul be subject under the higher power, for there is no power, no legal authority, but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. And whosoever therefore resists the power, resists the ordinances of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation." Now, most pastors teach that Romans 13 says subjects obey your government. It does not. Rather, it teaches, let every soul be subject to the supreme or the higher authority. Now, the last time I checked, every soul means just that, every soul. This applies to kings, presidents, congressmen, judges, and governors. Therefore, what this scripture really teaches is there is what we call a divine or universal chain of command. established by God, and every soul is accountable to it. Now, if we were to give a graphic illustration of this doctrine, it would look something like this. God as the highest ranking in the chain of command, government, and then citizens. Therefore, from this scripture, we can derive 3 points. Point 1, there is no power, no legal authority, but that which has been ordained by God. This is what we call divine authority, and it supersedes all other authority. Christ is the highest authority in every nation and over every government official. He is actually the highest ranking authority in the universe. He is mankind's king, our lawgiver, and our judge. Every federal or state executive, every lawmaker, every judicial official finds themselves under this divine authority, regardless of whether they acknowledge or recognize their place in this universal chain of command. Therefore, any and all authority that any government official possesses is simply a delegated authority. This leads us to point 2. Government officials are exercising delegated authority. This is what we call limited government. The Bible is actually the original and ultimate guide on the proper limitations of government. It not only tells individuals what they can and cannot do, it tells kings and other government officials what they are allowed or not allowed to do in the performance of their official duties. When these government officials govern according to biblical principles, laws, and commands, they are acting as God's ministers and should be given our honor, support, and our obedience. Which leads us to point 3. As Christian citizens, we should submit to the ordinances of man when they do not violate the laws of God, or the universal chain of command. Now let's take a look at how we're supposed to apply this to our lives. This illustration here shows a lawful government and an unlawful government. This is a visual representation of what it means to be one nation under God. Until the 1960s, America was this type of a nation. And as Americans, we once again need to be united around this political ideology. This is the only biblical model of a legitimate government. The next illustration shows what happens when an individual citizen rebels against God. Government's job is to restrain evil. So if God passes a law saying thou shalt not murder, governments have both the moral and the delegated legal authority to pass laws forbidding murder and then imposing civil penalties upon the crime. Romans 13:4 continues, but if you do evil, be afraid, for he, the government official, does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. This next illustration shows what happens when government officials begin to pass laws that are not allowed to be passed under the divine authority of heaven. This is what our founding fathers called tyranny, and it happens when a government official comes out from under the divine authority with regard to his official duties. Now, we do need to make a distinction between a government leader as an individual and a government leader acting in a government capacity as either a king, lawgiver, or a judge. As an individual, if the government leader commits a violation of God's law, for example, murder or adultery, he simply becomes an individual transgressor. However, tyranny is when the government leader is acting in a government capacity as either a king, lawgiver, or a judge, and then begins to pass laws ordering its citizens to disobey the laws of God. This basically places the citizen in a no-win or a catch-22 situation, because you are being forced by law into a scenario that you have to decide whether to obey the laws of man or the laws of God. Now, this last illustration shows an entire nation in rebellion to God. This happens when you either have wicked people electing wicked leaders to justify their lifestyle, or because the citizens are more fearful of what the tyrant can do to them than they are what God can do. Now, if you remember in the book of Acts, the Sanhedrin actually commanded the apostles not to preach the name of Christ anymore. How did they respond to these government officials? They said, we must obey God rather than man. As we will see, this is the most important phrase that you can ever say to an unjust government tyrant. Now let's see if we cannot justify this position from the rest of Scripture. We will do this by considering two stories from the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar built a statue and passed a law stating that whoever does not fall down and worship this statue shall be thrown into a fiery furnace. This was a clear violation of the higher authority, since God's first two commandments forbid this type of action. At this point, King Nebuchadnezzar became a tyrant because, acting as a government official, he passed a law commanding his citizens to disobey God. And the Hebrew men found themselves really in a no-win situation. The only position that they could take was, we ought to obey God rather than man. Therefore, their response was this: we have no need to answer you in this matter. We will not serve your gods, nor will we worship the old image that you have set up. Today we would call this an act of civil disobedience. They chose to disobey the tyrant so they could remain obedient to God. So you can see very clearly that the Bible does not require us to submit to every law of human government. When you understand the true interpretation of Romans 13, you understand that the king, acting as a delegated official, had no legal authority to override the commandments of the one who actually outranked him. And the citizens, therefore, were under no legal obligation to obey such an unjust law. Now let's consider the story of Daniel. When he had distinguished himself above all the other government officials, they conspired to kill him. And they said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the laws of his God. They were conspiring to put Daniel in a no-win or a catch-22 situation in which he would be forced to either disobey the laws of man or the commandments of God. Therefore, they convinced King Darius to pass a law forbidding anybody in the kingdom to pray for 30 days, or they shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, when King Darius passed this law, he became a tyrant, because acting as a government official, he passed a law commanding his citizens to disobey God. This left Daniel in a no-win situation. What did he do? He went home and he broke the law, and he committed an act of civil disobedience. Daniel 6:10 reads, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, or the law was passed, he went home, and in his upper room with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since his early days. Daniel chose to disobey the tyrant so that he could remain obedient to God. So again, you can see very clearly that the Bible does not require us to submit to every law of human government. When you understand and apply the universal chain of command, you understand that King Darius, acting as a government official, had no authority to override the commandment of the one who outranked him. And as a citizen, Daniel was under no legal obligation to obey such an unjust law. It was essentially this type of civil disobedience, this disobeying a tyrant and obeying God, that led to the birth of an American nation. When the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress created a committee to design a great seal for this new nation. The committee consisted of 3 of America's most prominent founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. Their recommendation to Congress demonstrates the biblical influence underpinning the American cause. Ben Franklin chose an allegorical scene from the book of Exodus, described in his notes as Moses standing on the shore, extending his hands over the sea, thereby causing the same to overwhelm Pharaoh, who is sitting in an open chariot. The caption read, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Why? Because the founding fathers understood the divine chain of command and understood that God himself would deliver them from the hands of wicked and unjust leaders. Ronald Reagan had this to say at a prayer breakfast in Dallas, Texas in 1984 about the political ideology of our founding fathers. He said this, those who created our country, the founding fathers and mothers, understood that there is a divine order that transcends human order. And if we as a nation wish to be blessed, we are once again going to have to restore the divine order of the universe over this American nation. Now, I hope you see that we do not have to obey every law of human government, but that we are actually duty-bound to oppose any government official or government law that opposes the laws of God. As a matter of fact, this is the only way in which to restore a legitimate government. God will have legitimate government. And when a government leader rebels against God, God will either remove him from power as he did Pharaoh, or due to the steadfast faith of God's people, the leader will once again recognize his place in the divine chain of command. Let me ask you this question. With this lesson in mind, Why do you think that the early church was persecuted for the first 300 years of its existence? Because they were running around telling people Jesus loved them and died for their sins? That was part of the message. But ultimately, the message was a restoration of the divine order of the universe. The world was upside down. Man had made himself God. Caesar thought he was God. So when the apostles went from town to town, they went around telling people that we do not have to obey the laws of Caesar, for there is a king that outranks him, and his name is Jesus Christ. If we are going to restore America to its biblical foundations, we are once again going to have to restore the divine order of the universe, God, government, and citizens.